there's a lot of help out there for how to draw. And that's great and all, but there's not a lot that talks specifically about how to sketch. Now, sketches are, in short, the construction of what will be the final illustration. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Marge was learning how to paint. It was conveying the simplifying of things into basic shapes. It's about understanding the complexity of what you're going to create so you can simplify it and then represent it through simple shapes so that you can add to it and make something complex. I'm probably making it more confusing here, so let's make it simpler with an example. This is a skull. A human skull. I won't tell you how I obtained this human skull. Suffice it to say, I did what I had to do. And I don't regret it. You do this for the art. So you look at this shape of this human skull and it's complex. There's lots of rivets and cracks and ridges and objectively a very organic looking shape and pretty complex. And if you want to draw this on different angles, you have to have an innate understanding of physical space and mass and how the object reacts to light and what it looks like on different angles. And there's a lot to understand, especially if you're trying to start learning how to draw, and yet understanding something like a part of human anatomy is pretty critical when you're starting to learn how to draw. So we've got to learn how to simplify it first. Now, keeping in mind, I've been drawing for more than half my life, actually since I was 11 years old, and I'm turning 31 this year. So for 20 years, I've been a self-taught artist, and even with that experience, if I just start drawing a skull on a piece of paper, it doesn't look as great as I'd like it to. It doesn't look bad, but because I don't have a great foundation to work on, I don't have much confidence in the physicality that the final shape will take, which is why the sketch is useful. And the outcome is, it's all right. You know, you could look at it and feel like it's reasonably three-dimensional and it looks like a skull, but it doesn't look great. The sketch removes the confusion and the questioning in the process so that I can confidently draw the details and know that the proportions are gonna look good when I add them in because I'm doing it based on that sketch. And we do that just by breaking it down into those basic shapes. Everyone in how to draw books and videos or whatever shows how the simple shapes make up the complex thing. But think instead of breaking down the complex thing into the simple shapes first. So the skull has a cranium and a jaw. Now I could say it's just an oval and a semicircle, which some like drawing books or guides tell you to draw. But frankly, if you're drawing the skull on a side or looking up, it's going to look very different. So lean on your references and try and convert that into a much more simplified but accurate representation in simple shapes. That way, it's not just an oval and a semicircle. It's sort of like that, but it's more based on shapes that represent what you're going to end up trying to draw. Then, especially when it comes to something like a face or a skull, there are a couple of references you can add in there, like a center line, which indicates the direction that the object or person is facing, and an eye line or a position line for, in this case, the position of the eyes. The point is, side by side, with and without a basic sketch as a foundation, you can see that the drawing of the skull on my sketch of the skull looks much more physically present. It looks more three-dimensional. So that is the process of what should be included in a sketch. The complex idea simplified so you can add the complexity on top. And then when you get used to this process and when you train your brain to understand 3 dimensions and how to convey that in 2 dimensions, you're just gonna get better and better at being able to reposition things on different angles or draw that skull without a reference on a different angle or in a different pose, knowing what the very core shapes of those objects are meant to be. Then we can take that same process and apply it to the human body. Now there are lots of examples of how to draw the human body that says draw a circle for the shoulder muscles and a oblong for the chest, I don't know. But again, that's another example of it not really reflecting what you need to be able to learn, which is how to replicate and simplify the complexities of human anatomy into really simple and basic shapes. So the best way to do this, the best way to learn how to do this is reference, reference, reference. There are plenty of resources out there for reference images that you can use that'll help you on your journey and help you practice. But at the end of the day, really what you're doing is training your brain to understand that relationship between 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions on the paper, and your eyes and hands. And it takes time. So what you should include in your sketch are the shapes that make up the silhouette of your character or create that sense of 3 dimensions that you're trying to convey, particularly when you're doing things like foreshortening, a sketch of this should include those blocks, and sometimes I add reference lines to the outside of the arm just so that my mind understands that this is the three-dimensional shape that I'm drawing on a piece of paper that looks like an oval, but in my head I know is a
cylinder.
Some of these important features to convey might be things like props, a hat, a cape, or a piece of fruit, but it's also really important to not include certain things like texture or detail. Just don't waste your time, because the most important thing about a sketch is that it's maneuverable, that you can undo something you've sketched and retry it and reshape it. And if you start thinking about detail or texture, you're not going to be willing to go back. And it's going to muddy up the whole process, so that by the time you get to the refined line work or anything you want to do on top, you won't even know what you're looking at. Here are some examples of some refined final sketches, and you'll see that when I crossfade into the line work that I've done on top of those sketches, although the sketches are, 80% of the form and structure of the characters or whatever I drew, that last 20% really comes down to just details and textures. Stuff I actually added without any sketch or indication as to where they would go, but things that I've practiced and learned and trust that I know how to put in place. Now to part 2 of the video, how to sketch. I actually have 2 approaches to sketching based on the intention of what I'm trying to make. I like to think of this as rough sketching and refined sketching. The point of rough sketching is exploration. So when I'm rough sketching, I'm usually really sloppy, and that's the point. It really loosens me up. So rough sketching is really loose and relaxed. It's very scribbly. It often starts scribbliest at the beginning, and then through the process of sketching, especially as your mind sort of rests and settles into ideas that you like, you slowly become a little bit more refined. Still really loose and relaxed in the physicality of it, but by this time you've also warmed up a bit, so you're just sort of more confident and making more certain decisions. Now, let's say I did a rough sketch that I absolutely loved and I wanted to lock it in and make it something perfect and final. Well, because my rough sketching is usually quite heavy-handed, if I did line work on top and erase the sketch, there'd be all these faint lines of the sketch underneath. It would indent the paper, and it would often be quite messy. So if I did a rough sketch that I fell in love with, I would start again and change the way I sketch to suit the intent. The intent of rough sketching is the sketch itself. The intent of refined sketching is the illustration or the drawing you're trying to end up with, which is usually refined. It's in line work or digital sketch form, or it might involve color or paint or whatever, but the sketch in this instance is the means to the end, which is the final artwork. And the way I approach refined sketching is physically very different. With a rough sketch, I'm very heavy-handed, I'm pushing pretty hard, and I'm being very loose. And you'll notice I'm holding close-ish to the tip of the pencil, and I'm really drawing very much with my wrist and very scribbly. Even when I go to shift down here to draw a refined sketch, I crawl up the back of the pencil, and the pencil lowers on the paper, and the way I draw on the paper is so much lighter. It's hard to even describe how much different my refined sketch process is than my rough process. A rough sketch involves longer unbroken lines and more erratic movement, enabling me to be pretty free, maneuver very quickly into different ideas. With the refined sketching, it starts off as the broader shapes. It's much more open in how I start off. Bigger shapes, focusing on structure and 3 dimensions conveyed in 2 dimensions. I hold the pencil much more lightly towards the middle or even the end, and I'm moving with my whole arm from the elbow rather than from the wrist, scribbling at the end of the pencil. Rough sketching, refined sketching. See how I'm moving from the elbow? Now, all of those examples that I showed before of the refined sketch then turned into line work, they were all my refined sketches. And if I take it back to earlier in the process of drawing those sketches, you'll notice that it starts really simple and the physical motions are much more delicate, just a little more calculated. I'm still quite loose because by this time, I've done a lot of rough sketching to get to the concept I want to work on. So even though I'm being more refined, I still need to make sure I hold on to my creative flow and let myself feel organic about it. I don't want to get rigid and tense, but I am just lightening up a little bit, taking it a bit slower. And just as a case in point, on the left you have a rough sketch process, and on the right it's the illustration. The point of what I'm doing there is to create a final depiction of what I've already explored and decided I want to draw. In my mind, they are two extremely different methods of sketching, which is why I've always found it a little bit frustrating that it's not talked about as much as it should or could be, because there's more than one way to sketch or purpose for sketching. Because I know that for me, the fun starts with the sketch. And if you're hitting a brick wall and you're frustrated with the process, chances are you're not loose enough, which you can do through the sketching process, or you're trying to get to the details and the final structure without having that solid foundation to build on. So there it is, my guide on how to sketch and what that looks like and feels like. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see more tips and tricks, I'm open to exploring a bit of that. Not necessarily tutorials, but more deep dives into a specific tip or trick that I find really fun to share visually and explore in a way that hasn't really been done a lot. I mean, that's what I like to do here. Explore things that I haven't done or that haven't been done a lot. Sort of thing I find most interesting, and I hope you do too. There are more videos over there that you probably haven't seen anywhere else, because again, I like to do weird and different stuff, and I'll probably keep doing that into the future. But make sure to subscribe if you want to see all of that weird and different stuff into the future. Hit like if you enjoyed this video. That is it for now, and until next time, I'll see you later.